Let's install a big brake kit by Baer Brakes in 5 minutes on this 2019 Ford F-150. Step 1 is to get it in the air and get the wheels off. Next, we're going to pop off these calipers by removing these 13mm bolts on the back side. Once you've got those bolts removed, take a pry bar and pry off the caliper and carefully hang it up out of the way. Next, take your pry bar and pry out those brake pads. Now take a 21mm socket and break loose those caliper bracket bolts. And once those are removed, you can remove the caliper bracket. Next, we'll install the provided hardware onto the new caliper bracket and remove the old pins from the old caliper bracket. We had an issue with two of ours where rusted stuck, which you see here. So the next thing you're going to want to do is clean those up really good and prepare them for some fresh grease. Once you've got those greased up, you can install those in the new caliper bracket, making sure they move in and out freely. Here you can see just how much bigger the Baer brakes are over the stock. They're also cross-drilled and slotted. Next, I'll take a wire wheel on a drill and I'm going to clean up the mating surface on the wheel bearing. Once that's clean, I will take some grease and I'll put a little bit of grease on there as well to make it easier to get the rotor off the next time. We'll also clean both sides of the rotor surface and install that. You'll notice here, once I'm trying to install, we're hitting our dust shield. So what I'm going to do is just remove it, but you can trim it down if you prefer. With the dust shield removed, we can install the rotor as it now fits perfectly. And we'll put a nut on just to hold it in place so we can install the rest. I'll use a little bit of Loctite, some blue stuff is my preference, and we'll install that caliper bracket. Get it torqued down and add a little grease to the sliding portions for the pads, and we'll install the new pads. Once the pads are in place, I'll put a little grease on them to prevent any squealing, and then we'll spread the pistons back into the calipers. If you have a tool that works, it's a lot easier. I ended up having to get a little bit creative. Now all we have to do is slide the caliper back over the bracket and over the pads and reinstall those 13mm bolts and torque them down. Here we've got a nice before and after, a stock rotor, stock caliper bracket to the Baer Brakes big brake kit, rotor and bracket. Now let's move to the back of the truck. Same thing, you're going to remove the 13mm bolts holding the caliper in place. Once that's done, you can pull the caliper loose and hang it off over the axle like I've done here. Next step is going to be remove the pins. These were free, so they just came out nicely. We'll clean them up and grease them. After that, you can remove the brake pads and set them aside. Once the brake pads are off, you can remove the stock hardware. Next, you can grab your caliper spreader and push the piston back into the caliper. And then knock the old rotor off and get that out of the way. Here we've got the Baer Brakes rotor versus a stock rotor. They're the same size. The biggest difference here is going to be in the pads. You can see how much more surface area on the new pads there are than on the stock ones. Now it's time to clean and grease the pins and put them in place in the stock caliper brackets, making sure they move and spin freely. I'll clean off the surface of the wheel bearing and we'll prepare that for the rotor. Once the rotor's in place, I'll put a couple lug nuts down to hold it centered. I'll install the brake hardware supplied in the kit. Then I'll install the new brake pads. Now we can put the caliper back in place and install it with the stock hardware. After the calipers are torqued down, all that's left to do is put the wheels back on, put the lug nuts on and torque them down. I'm using a torque stick. Finally, before you move the truck, make sure you pump the pedal a bunch of times to build brake pressure and push those pads back onto the rotors.